Hello and welcome to this episode of Shattered Ice Rambles, and today I am going to be rambling about something very nostalgic to me, and that is this: Games Workshop's Inquisitor. This was really one of the first tabletop games I ever played outside of Warhammer 40k, although it's not really outside of Warhammer 40k because it is based in that universe, and this game was made way back in 2001 as part of Games Workshop's Specialist Games projects, which included various games such as Battlefleet Gothic, which was like space battles, Mordheim, which was kind of similar to Inquisitor but based in Warhammer Fantasy, and you also had Blood Bowl, and I think there was Epic 40k, but anyway, we're here to talk about Inquisitor, as this is a game that holds a lot of fond memories for me and is very near and dear to my heart. I've had this rulebook for about 23 years now. It's quite possibly older than some of you listening to this video. And these days, Warhammer 40k videos are a dime a dozen on YouTube. Everybody knows what Warhammer is now. It's all over the place. Games like Space Marine and Space Marine 2 have made it really popular. But I very rarely see anybody talk about Inquisitor, which was essentially Games Workshop's answer to Dungeons & Dragons. The book refers to it as a narrative skirmish game. And what that basically means is a skirmish game, much like small-scale war games, where you will be moving miniatures around on a board full of terrain, using a tape measure, rolling dice, that kind of thing. But the key difference is the narrative aspect, which was what Games Workshop really focused on here. So how did they go about this? Well, Inquisitor was designed for 3 players rather than 2, as is the case with most war games. Or more accurately to say, it was designed for 2 players and a third person to act as the games master, which essentially is like the dungeon master from Dungeons & Dragons. And the games master's job would basically be to construct a narrative or use one of the available supplements that were published at the time. There were 3 of these. Unfortunately, I only ever managed to get my hands on 2, but they were a lot of fun to play. The game master could also invent their own narrative, which we often used to do when we played this a lot. And the way you'd basically do this is each of the players would control a warband, as it was called, which consisted of usually an Inquisitor and his henchmen. So basically 2 little gangs of Inquisitors. And the narrative would always revolve around some kind of objective that both of these Inquisitors wanted, but for different purposes. So of course that's where the conflict comes in. Inquisitor was all about this narrative, and that influenced play quite a lot. And to understand why that is, let's first talk about what an Inquisitor actually is. Now, if you're familiar with Warhammer 40k, you're probably already aware of the Inquisition. They do feature in the big game of 40k. But for those of you who aren't, an Inquisitor in the Warhammer 40k universe is essentially, they are the secret police of Warhammer 40k, to put it simply. They go around fighting the enemies of the Imperium of Man that lurk within the shadows. They fight the heretic, the alien, and the demon. But this isn't some war. The Inquisitor's fight takes place in the seedy underbelly of the Imperium, in the hive cities and the forge worlds, and all these kind of places. And rather than fighting armies of orcs or gene stealers or demons or any of the other stuff from 40k, they are principally there to root out essentially traitors within the Imperium, and this will often lead them into conflict with cults that are trying to summon demons, or perhaps renegades who are defecting to serve some alien race. And so there is a lot of scope for story here. So an example of how a game of Inquisitor might go is that the 2 players each play an inquisitorial warband. The game master sets up the premise of the game, in which a crime lord, let's call him Don Corleone, is smuggling alien technology. One of the Inquisitors is looking for Don Corleone, and he plans to interrogate him for information, find out where the alien technology is, and smash his entire heretical, treacherous enterprise, as of course alien technology is outlawed within the Imperium. The other Inquisitor is also looking for Don Corleone, but here is the twist in the tale. The Game Master will set the scene. The planet, Don Corleone, what both players know is what's happening, but information will be given to them individually, such as in the case of that first Inquisitor. Let's call him Inquisitor Starmer. So, Inquisitor Starmer will be told in private, or perhaps if the Game Master really wants to go all out, he could make a letter, some physical prop, a letter from the other members of the Inquisition who have found this information and want Inquisitor Starmer to crack down on this traitor. And that letter would say, basically, you need to find Don Corleone and interrogate him and find this information, blah, blah, blah. The second Inquisitor, however, let's call him Inquisitor Sunak, is told in secret by the Games Master Inquisitor Sunak is in fact the one who has been commissioning Don Corleone to get this alien technology for him, because he wants to use it to the benefit of the Imperium. But the reason Inquisitor Sunak is looking for Don Corleone isn't to help him, it's not for information. He already has the cargo. He wants to kill Don Corleone and silence him, tying up any loose ends. And this is where the conflict comes in. And a great story can be woven out of this, where the two Inquisitors don't know each other's end game. However, they do know they both have to get to Don Corleone for their own reasons. And of course, this can spin out into a campaign of multiple games if Inquisitor Starmer interrogates Don Corleone and finds out about that alien technology. Well, now he knows that Inquisitor Sunak is involved, and so you can have a big campaign of Inquisitor Starmer hunting down Inquisitor Sunak. And on it goes. So that is the theme of this game. This is what you are doing with the Inquisitor. You're trying to tell kind of a gothic noir sci-fi tale. And the games you play, the skirmishes, are basically the moments within this story where the main characters come into conflict and end up fighting each other. Now, while the game is designed for 2 players with a Games Master, it is also perfectly possible to play this with 1 player and a Games Master. It just means that you don't have that second Inquisitorial warband played by another player. Instead, it is basically the Games Master who takes on the role of many NPCs and just kind of tells the story to 1 player. You could do the same thing, it's the Games Master who is playing one of the 2 warbands. And this was unfortunately, or fortunately, the way I used to play this game a lot when I was younger, because there just weren't many people playing this game. There was only me and one good friend of mine who I used to play this with a lot. We used to play every weekend. I think we probably preferred this to regular Warhammer 40k. So there's your basic premise of the game. So let's talk about characters, because this game, you didn't just have an Inquisitor with no name. These were characters. They were designed to be played as part of a story. And you would design your own characters. Usually, this would involve making an Inquisitor and then 3 or 4 henchmen to go with him. And we'll have a look a little later through the henchmen available and how you actually create those characters. The first thing you would normally come up with is your Inquisitor's alignment. In Inquisitor, you had Puritan Inquisitors and Radical Inquisitors. I suppose you could technically have had a Heretic Inquisitor as well. The difference between these were the idea that Puritan Inquisitors, and this is within 40k lore as well, it's not just for the game, but Puritan Inquisitors are those who believe in the ironclad rules of the Imperium. They don't bend the rules, they don't break them. Anybody doing anything out of sorts, such as smuggling alien technology, for example, that's heresy. That is completely verboten, and the penalty, as is the case with most things in 40k, is death. Then there is the Radical Inquisitors, The radicals are usually the Inquisitors who have been Inquisitors for longer. They've sort of been a little bit corrupted by their years of service. Because in the world of Warhammer 40k, it's not uncommon for a human being to live to be a couple of hundred years old. And so when they've been an Inquisitor for a long time, they become jaded and start to realise that the Imperium needs all the help it can get. So they might see the benefits in utilising alien technology, alien weapons, something like that. In some cases, Inquisitors even go so far as to try and harness the power of chaos. Which, for anyone who doesn't know, chaos basically refers to the demons in the world of Warhammer 40k. The warp space through which interstellar travel is possible is in fact an alternate dimension. And within that dimension there are sentient beings, which they're kind of multi-dimensional aliens from a scientific perspective, but they are just thought of as demons, and they behave like demons. And some Inquisitors will try to create things called demon hosts, where a demonic entity, one of the warp beings, is bound into the body of a human and can then be used for all its supernatural magical powers and things like that. And pretty much every single Inquisitor would regard this as heresy, but some do slip that far down the line. So once you've made your decision whether you want your Inquisitor and the whole theme of how you play the game to be like a stuck-up, law-abiding, hard-nosed type, or a sneaky edgelord, basically, you can then move on to making your Inquisitor. And that is done here on page 97 of the rulebook, where we have a table for Inquisitor characters. We've also got Inquisitor Covenant on here, who is one of the Inquisitors pre-made for the game. So there were a series of pre-made characters that you could just choose to play those if you wanted, but it was always more fun to make your own. And that is what these tables were about. Because it used a D100 system, all of the stats of a character were out of 100. And if you're familiar with Warhammer 40k, you will notice some quite similar stats on this table, but there were more than usual. So we've got weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, toughness, initiative, willpower, sagacity, nerve, and leadership. So having these extra stats allowed a lot of new kind of ways for the game to play. So for example, nerve was, how sort of hardened a character would be. At certain points during a game, you might have to take a nerve test, which is what everything was referred to in this game. It was always a test, a willpower test, sagacity test, nerve test, etc. So if your Inquisitor comes under heavy fire, he might have to take a nerve test, and if he fails, the games master might say, because you failed your nerve test, you dive into cover, and your next turn you have to recover. You can't come out of the cover until you've passed a nerve test. Something like that. So it adds this extra element to the game. But we'll get onto gameplay in a little bit, because first let's take a look at how we make our Inquisitor. So if you want to make your own, if you notice, you have three types of Inquisitor: an Acolyte, an Inquisitor, and a Lord. Each one has a set of stats, and there are standard stats on here, but you can also randomly generate them. So for example, if you're playing a Acolyte Inquisitor, his weapon skill, so his proficiency with melee weapons, is going to be 65 plus 2d10, which of course means you roll two 10-sided dice, and then you add whatever the result of that is to 65. So if you roll, 5 and a 1, your weapon skill would be 71. And you do this for all of the stats following the directions. Of course, if you really enjoy making a character and you come up with a backstory for your character, then there is nothing wrong in this game, as long as, of course, the game master okays it and everybody is fine with it, to tweaking these. So you might be playing an Acolyte who is an incredibly powerful psyker, somebody who uses psychic powers, and most psychic powers use the willpower stat. So you might say 60 plus 3d10. Okay, that's a potential of 90, that's a very high willpower. But this is where you want him to excel. So you might say that you're just setting his willpower to 90, at the highest you can get it. But conversely, well, he focuses on his mind, so maybe his weapon skill and ballistic skill are really low because he doesn't use weapons very much. So instead of rolling with 2d10, you just say his ballistic skill is 50. You know, it's lower than it's actually meant to be according to the average number generation. And that's kind of the spirit of making a character in Inquisitor. They should kind of reflect the background of what you've given them. Of course, you don't have to do that. So once you've got all your stats, you pick special abilities for your characters. And usually the idea would be to take, 2 or 3 of these, and as we can see here, there is a fair few of them. So you've got things like ambidextrous, which means you can use both of your hands with equal skill, because in Inquisitor, your character, unless they were ambidextrous, would have an offhand, which means if a character was right-handed and they're shooting 2 pistols, well, the pistol in their left hand would have a negative penalty to shooting it, because this is the kind of depth Inquisitor went into. It was a very deep game. I'm not going to go through all of these special abilities, of course, but there were plenty of them to allow you to make characters in the way you wanted. So you could have a gunslinger type character, who's got fast draw and gunfighter and quick load. You could have somebody who is kind of an assassin type, who's very good with swords, who has abilities like deflect shot and lightning reflexes. And you could make a fair amount of a variety in your characters from these special abilities. We mentioned about psychers earlier, so if your character had any psychic abilities, then you actually had several pages of these different disciplines of psychic powers, some of which were really cool. You had like biomancy, where you have psychic powers like blood boil, and it gives you a little description of the psyker reaches into his enemy's body with his mind, rapidly accelerating the target's pulse and pushing his blood pressure to near lethal levels. In the most spectacular successes, the victim's heart and brain explodes. It's very gory stuff. You of course had telepathy, so you had lots of psychic powers that you could pick from, and this really helped to make characters completely unique. Oh, there was also exotic abilities, which were exceptionally rare. Usually these would require well, they wouldn't require it. You could technically do whatever you wanted. You could make a character with every single special ability in the book if you wanted, but that's really against the spirit of the game. Exotic abilities would usually be something justified by backstory. For example, you would have an ability like fearsome. So maybe one of your characters, your Inquisitor perhaps, is disfigured in some way that gives him a very fearsome look. He's really battle scarred and people are kind of scared to look at him. Or maybe he wears some kind of horrifying mask. Who knows? It could be anything. But these were kind of very exceptional abilities that weren't meant to be sort of just dotted around. Not everybody would have one. And once you've got your special abilities, it's time to go to the armory. This is where you give your characters all of their equipment, and there is just so much stuff in here. You've got the basic gun of the Imperium, the las gun, but in Inquisitor you've got 3 different patterns of las gun: the Mars pattern, the Necromunda pattern, and the Triplex pattern, all of which are slightly different. Then you've got, long rifles, multi-lasers, las cannons. This is just one section of the weapons page. You go to the standard weapons of the Imperium. You've got auto pistol, auto gun, revolver, stubber, heavy stubber, assault cannon, hunting rifle, naval pistol, dueling pistol, shotgun, sawn-off shotgun, pump-action combat shotguns, automatic combat shotguns. There were so many weapons, each one with its different set of stats. So we've got bolt weapons. You've got like about 10 different types of bolt weapon. Instead of just the bolt gun that appears in Warhammer 40k, you've got all these different types with different advantages and drawbacks. Then you can get melter weapons, you can get plasma weapons, flamers, throwing weapons, even primitive weapons. If you want your Inquisitor to be armed with a musket, why not? Then there's exotic weapons. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's so many, but you can see from these pages that there are just tons of weapons to equip your Inquisitor's warband with. And then you've got close combat weapons. There's not quite as many of these, but there is plenty, ranging from like sort of very standard weapons like short swords and axes and things like that, to the very iconic chain swords of Warhammer 40k, and then power swords and other power weapons, which are basically swords with like an energy field around them. And then you've got even grenades. You can equip your characters with different types of grenades, demolition charges, melter bombs, blind grenades, all this sort of stuff. And then as you move further through these pages, there's different types of armor and force fields. So you can equip your characters with flak armor, with carapace armor, with mesh armor, even with power armor. There's various types of force fields you can get. There is so much in this book. There's even more stuff you can use to make your character unique, and that's bionics and implants. So characters might have a bionic arm, or a bionic brain even, you know, bionic lungs, all sorts of stuff. You could make whatever you wanted in this game as a character. So that's equipment. And once you've got your stats, your abilities, your equipment, all that's left to do is give your Inquisitor a name, and that's them done. And then you'll do this process again, but this time you will be making your Inquisitor's warband. And of course, like I said right at the start of this, it doesn't have to be an Inquisitor who is sort of leading the warband. You could make a different warband essentially. It's just the game was built around the idea of Inquisitors, so that's kind of the assumption. But there are many different archetypes of characters. So as you can see here, we've even got Space Marine characters. Space Marines were ludicrously powerful, and you wouldn't have an Inquisitor leading a warband of Space Marines. It would just be preposterous. In fact, I think the way we used to play was if you used a Space Marine character, you could only have one other character with them, or maybe two, I can't remember. But basically, because of how powerful Space Marine was, you had to be disadvantaged in some way. Because that was the other thing about Inquisitor. It did have kind of a point system, but it was a very ropey point system, not like 40k where, or any other war game where there's some level of balance in the point system. Inquisitor really didn't balance very well. So we tended to play, and I think it was kind of recommended, the way you would play was with a level of sensibleness. You know, this was a bit more of a mature game, and so even if you made a Space Marine using the point system, they would still be overpowered. But you could make them, and they did make for a fun appearance once in a while. Then we had members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, so you could have one of those in your warband. Rogue traders, the pirates of the Imperium, basically, who go around pirating on behalf of the Imperium usually, and themselves. So you could have like swashbucklers in your team. The cultists and fanatics, so these were like the religious zealots of the Imperium, who would no doubt be following the Inquisitor to bring the Emperor's light to his enemies, kind of thing. The Imperial Guard veteran was a common one to see, as these were just kind of military hard cases who an Inquisitor would pick up on his travels and think, I like the cut of this guy's jib, we'll take him with us. And then you also had desperados, like this chap here, Slick Devlin. These tended to be like mercenary types, gunslingers, who were good at shooting and would do anything for money. So these were kind of the mercenaries that an Inquisitor might hire. Then there were the enforcers, so these were essentially the standard police force, like the security services of the Imperium. And on some occasions, not uncommon for an Inquisitor to conscript one into their service, whether a temporary thing or long-term. And then you could even get like mutant characters, which mutants are, very much a shunned sort of people in the world of Warhammer 40k, as they are seen as like kind of abominations to the Emperor. But they exist, and some Inquisitors, usually the more radical ones, might take them on. And mutants, of course, because they are mutated, could often have some more interesting abilities. It would be, a mutant would be far more likely to have one of those exotic abilities we mentioned earlier, because that might well be their mutation. They might have mutated to be sort of a terrifying character, or they might have mutated to have a regenerate, where they regenerate their organs and limbs and what have you. Then there's ecclesiarchy characters, which are more holy characters, kind of the preachers of the Imperium. A lot of these things do appear in sort of the standard Warhammer 40k game, but this is where it really fleshed them out. A lot of armies in Warhammer 40k back at this time didn't have preachers and things like that. They were a lot more standardized, and I think it was Inquisitor that kind of brought the idea of these characters and how they could be implemented into armies for standard games of Warhammer 40k. Then we've got arco-flagellant characters, which were usually, these are one of the really grim, dark things that really shows you what the universe of Warhammer 40k is all about. These were normally convicts who had been surgically altered to be living weapons. They'd wear these helmets that kind of keep them sedated, and they just lumber around until the Inquisitor, or whoever controls them, says a trigger word. And when the trigger word is uttered, the pacifier helm, as it was called, is disengaged, and the arco-flagellant is filled with combat stims that sends them into like a berserk rage. So these things were kind of fun to use, in that they would just sort of be this mad brawling sort of enemy, or this mad brawling character that just goes absolutely berserk at some point when that trigger word is mentioned, and all bets are off at that point. Then there's assassin characters as well, such as death cultists, and there's not a lot really to say about assassins. For the most part, they were just like fast sword user types. Makes sense why an Inquisitor, a secret policeman, might have some kind of assassin working for them. And then lastly, we have the demon hosts I mentioned earlier. So yeah, you could even make a demon host character to be a thrall to your Inquisitor. And of course, they would use lots of psychic powers and all that sort of stuff. So those are the different character types that were available to you when creating a warband and playing this game. And as you can see, there's a fair few of them, and it gives lots of variety. And then towards the back end of the rulebook, you've got an entire section that is specifically dedicated to the game master, which is essentially part of the book there to teach you how to be a games master, what the idea of the game is, the things we said earlier about telling the story and things like that, and how best to go about running a game. But we're not going to go into that too much. It's a nice little section of the book. It gives ideas for scenario concepts, things like that, and sort of teaches you the ropes of what you're trying to do. But let's talk about the actual gameplay of the game then. So like I mentioned earlier, it uses a D100 system, which means you roll two 10-sided dice. One of the dice counts as tens and one counts as units. So it gives you a total score of between 1 and 100. And at any time that you're called on to take a test of some kind, so for example, if you're trying to shoot at an enemy, you would do a ballistic skill test. And that would be done by looking at your character's ballistic skill and then rolling your D100, and you would try to roll under your skill number. So the higher your skill, the better. And it even had its own system for kind of critical hits. One thing Inquisitor would do is help increase your mental arithmetic skills, because it used a lot of percentages and a lot of modifiers. And to get a critical hit, to do this, you would have to roll under 10% of the test value. So if your ballistic skill was 70, then to get a critical hit, you would have to roll a 7 or less. So yeah, it did become quite the fiasco sometimes with the amount of percentages you'd be trying to calculate. It was definitely a game that, like I say, helped with mental arithmetic skills. And that's the basics of how most tests would work. It would be, here's the thing I'm trying to do, here is the statistic that is relevant to it, and that's what you've got to roll under. So, using a psychic power, you would have to roll under your willpower. If you were trying to lift up a heavy piece of metal for some reason, maybe trying to break open a door, then it would be a strength test. However, there were lots of modifiers in this game, and so we have this entire table of range modifiers, which it's crazy to look at this point, because there's just nothing else. I just don't think anything does anything with this level of detail. And now you'll notice it says on this table range in yards. A yard referred to an inch. It's just for thematic purposes they referred to it as a yard. And each ranged weapon would have its range would be a letter rather than an actual distance. And what that letter would do when you look along this chart is tell you what the negative modifier was based on how many yards away you are from the target. If we look at a fairly basic weapon like a Necromunda pattern lasgun, we can see it's got range E, and if we look along the range E part of the table, you can see that up to 10 yards there's no negative modifier, then up to 15 you've got -5, and then it suddenly drops off and starts getting a lot worse. So by the time you're 30 yards away from your target, you're getting a -45% to your ballistic skill. And if we look even further down the table, you can see at like 50 yards, you're getting like -105. So how can you even hit? Well, first of all, a critical hit is always a hit. But also, this is where you get many actions available to an Inquisitor, such as aiming. So aiming would increase your chances to hit by 20%, and I believe that was applied after the range was modified. So you'd basically, if you aimed, instead of getting -105, you'd get -85. So it's all very technical and like really deep stuff in there. But then there's tons of other modifiers. There's modifiers for how fast your target is moving, and that's based on that character's last movement action taken. Now, if we also look at this with weapons and how they work, not only do you have the letter for the range, but if you notice you've got a damage stat. If we look at that Necromunda pattern lasgun, its damage is 2d6. So whenever you successfully hit a target, you'll roll 2 6-sided dice and add that together, and that would be your total damage. So the lasgun was a relatively weak weapon with 2d6 damage, but you'd get some crazily powerful weapons. The bolt gun was a fairly common sight, and bolters would do 2d10 plus 4. You roll 2 10-sided dice, you add that together, and then you add 4 to the total. And this was one of the things with Inquisitor weapons like this were really good to have, because they had that consistency. If you're rolling 2d10 plus 4, you're guaranteed to do at least 6 damage. So if you're using a weapon such as the heavy bolter that does 3d10, well, that's got the potential to do 30 damage, but it's also got the potential to only do 3. So consistency was a nice thing to have in this game. And you also had a certain number of shots, because in Inquisitor you would have to reload your weapon. And the next stat after the shots is the reload stat. And this was how many actions you would have to spend to reload a weapon. So with Inquisitor, your character would have a set number of actions based on their speed. So of course some weapons, like if you look at the melter gun, it takes 6 actions to reload. This of course means it's probably going to cost you more than 1 full turn in the game to reload a melter gun. So weapons like that, very powerful, but you're probably not going to bother reloading them. They're probably something you're going to use and then just dump when you're done with it. But we don't want to get too into the weeds of this, because it is a really deep game, where you've got different stats for firing on semi-auto, for firing on full auto. And melee would be very similar. Melee fighting would be slightly less negative modifiers, but also you had the ability to parry and dodge and counter your enemy's attacks. A lot of the time, melee fights could go on for quite a while, as two skilled fighters would just be dodging and parrying back and forth for several turns. But usually, Inquisitor amusingly often had quite punchy endings to its fights, where, many times I would play Inquisitor and we'd have two melee fighters going back and forth for several rounds when neither of them can really hit each other. And then, kind of just like a real sword fight, the moment one person messes up and gets hit, that was it. Usually it was over. As soon as you landed that sword strike, you'd probably take off a limb. And that brings us to one of the really deep and very interesting elements of Inquisitor, which was you didn't just hit your target when you were in a fight, you hit a specific location, and you do this by rolling dice to determine where you hit with your shot or your stab. As we can see from these damage tables, each area of the body, so you've got head, abdomen, chest, groin, arms and legs. So yes, you could shoot people in the dick, and yes, it did happen. So you could shoot different areas of your target, and of course different areas would lead to different kinds of damage. And each body location had different levels of damage, so every character would have what was called a base injury value. This was done by dividing your character's toughness by 10. So if your character was toughness 60, his base injury level would be 6. And this would mean every time he takes damage in increments of 6, he would suffer an injury level. So let's say a character gets shot in the chest and they take 3 damage from this attack. Well, that would be the first increment of 6 would result in a light injury to the character's chest, which, as we can see here, it has an immediate effect of the character falls prone. If the character takes more than 6 points of damage to the chest, and this damage stays on the character, this isn't just from each hit. So if that character has taken, let's say, 3 points of damage from that previous shot, and he is shot again in the chest, and he takes another 4 points of damage, he now has a total of 7 points of damage on his chest, which would convert that injury from light to heavy. And as we can see here, the immediate effect as light, so the character would fall prone, they would fall over. Persistence, the character is at -1 speed. So that means for the rest of the game, unless you can heal that injury, that character is -1 speed. And this is actually quite devastating, because the way you would get actions in Inquisitor is you would have a speed value. I'm not going to go into it, but it was based off your initiative stat. And most characters would have a speed of usually around 4. What speed did was it determined which characters went. Unlike Warhammer 40k, where one army goes and then the other army goes, each character would activate individually based on their speed. Whoever has the highest speed goes first. Doesn't matter which warband they're in. So you could have, an Inquisitor with speed 5 might go first. Then on the other warband there might be a Desperado with speed 4, and he would go next, and so on. And this injury to the chest that we're looking at, so -1 speed, not only does it mean you're going to go later in the turn order, what you would actually do in Inquisitor, the basics of a turn for your character, the first thing you would do is you would roll a number of 6-sided dice equal to your character's speed. Well, no, let me rephrase that. The first thing you would do in a game of Inquisitor is look at your character's speed value. Let's say it's 4. And you would have to declare the 4 actions you wish to do on this turn. So you might say, my character is going to sprint down the street for 1 action. He's going to draw his pistol for 2 actions. He's then going to aim with his pistol for 3 actions. And then with his 4th action, he's going to fire his pistol at this enemy over here. And that was basically how you'd set up your turn. This is what you'd tell the games master and your opponent your plan is. Then you would roll a number of 6-sided dice equal to your speed. So in this case, 4. Every one of those dice that shows a 4+, gives you a successful action. And what that means is, in the example I just gave, if you rolled 4 dice and every single one of those dice was a 4, 5 or 6, you would do all of those actions. But if any of those dice are not higher than 4, then you cannot do the last action in that sequence, essentially, or the later action in that sequence. So with the example I gave earlier, if you rolled 3 4s and a 2, your character would sprint down the street, draw his weapon and aim, but he wouldn't have enough actions to shoot. So it's entirely possible, and it did happen, where you got a terrible action roll, as it was called, and your character would sprint out of cover and just stand there, and then usually get shot to pieces. So of course, just going back to that injury we were talking about, -1 speed doesn't just mean you're going later in the turn, it means you can't do as many actions. And that's how damage worked in the game. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that because there was all sorts of depth to it. As you can see, there was all sorts of depth to this game just on the whole. But that is the basics of how a turn would work. You like I say, you'd roll your dice for your actions, you'd try and do those actions, and ultimately you'd go back and forth through multiple game rounds until one of the warbands achieved their objective. So going right back to the start of this video, in that example with Inquisitor Starmer and Sunak, they just keep going back and forth until either Inquisitor Sunak kills Don Corleone or Inquisitor Starmer manages to interrogate him or capture him, or whatever, sort of the objective is. That's really all I'm going to say about the gameplay. I just wanted to go through my nostalgic love of this game, really. And it really is a shame that this game didn't get the love and support it really deserved. I mean, I can't do it justice with this little rambling, blabbering on about the rules, but if you've never played this, and you can manage to find the rules for it somewhere, it really was a great game. Oh, also, I can't believe I didn't mention this. It used 54mm scale miniatures, which at the time there was nothing else that did that. These were, you kind of look back on it and they're not really that big, but at the time these were like huge miniatures. They were twice the size of your average Warhammer 40k miniature, and it really made them feel like something more grandiose. I just felt like a little trip down memory lane. And if you haven't played Inquisitor, and you can find the rules somewhere, then I really would recommend it. It's an experience from kind of a different time. You're talking almost 25 years ago, and games were very different back then. Certainly there are better systems now, without a doubt, but this really was something special. It was so different and so detailed, and it really was just a great form of escapism. This to me was Games Workshop at its peak. It's never been the same since, sadly, but this game just oozed passion and effort, and so much went into it that it really is a shame that it got discontinued, but such is life. Anyway, that's enough of me wandering off down memory lane, and I hope you enjoyed this little look back into Games Workshop's past. And yeah, that's it really. Bye.